Welcome to the second part of my conversation with Professor Sue Weiss about Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano. In this part, we discuss some of the political and historical aspects of the novel. If you haven't yet listened to the first part, I suggest you check that out first. And if you're enjoying our conversation, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Welcome to the second part of our discussion on Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry with Sue Weiss. If you haven't watched the first part or listened to the first part, please do check that out first. And in the second part, we'll move a little bit more away from the characters and the alcoholism and into maybe some of the political aspects of the novel. So it's a novel set in 1938. So, we mentioned earlier that in terms of the plot of the story and the personal events, we know what's coming, but historically we know what's coming as well. The events of the novel are confined to a very small area. We're in Mexico, but at the same time, you've got world historical events, notably the Spanish Civil War, rumbling on in the background. So, do you read it as a historical novel, a political novel, or are these really just a background to a story about one man unraveling, and we're primarily interested in that sort of psychological aspect?
That's another really interesting question. Obviously, the political backdrop is really crucial. It is absolutely set on the brink of the war, and for anyone who reads it, and I hope there will be many who have their interest sparked off by it, you can't help but notice there's a lot of material and detail about the coming war, the Spanish Civil War, which the consul's half-brother Hugh has been engaged with, and also the situation of Mexico at that moment, where it has its own. There's a very mysterious telegram which Hugh has been, because he's been a journalist, he's sending to his newspaper, and it seems to hint at, which is apparently the case, of German destabilization of the unions in Mexico at the time, fomenting anti-Semitism, which came out into the wider arena. Yet again, I don't think you need to know the absolute detail of that background to be able to perceive and understand those little hints of what is coming. And obviously, just to take a step aside to think of the publication context, that Lowry had started writing it in the mid-30s, but he didn't publish it till after the war. So its publication history spans that whole era. So the kind of the foreshadowing of the war isn't an accident. The fact that it seems that at the very end, when, as I don't feel it's a spoiler to say that the consul dies at the end, because that is predicted in the very first chapter, so I hope that's right with everybody. But he becomes a kind of symbol for the end of peaceable life, and the way his death is described, which is, it's really a virtuoso description as well as upsetting. It's like the conflagration, the burning of the world, really, not just him. So to answer your question, I suppose it manages to unite the two things. We feel upset at the death of the character that we've come very close to, but also upset at the reliving of the impending signs of war coming. I think also, when I was rereading it now, and I haven't read it for a while, though I was very familiar with it at one time, I think there were two things that struck me slightly anew. One is that there's a kind of symbolism between the consul and his half-brother. The consul is kind of trapped into inertia. He can't really do anything to reunite himself with Yvonne, or to save himself. So he's like inaction, whereas Hugh is all about talking about action. He wants to return to being a sailor on the seas and taking part in fighting for the Republicans in the war, but yet he too isn't really doing anything. So there's kind of a division, as people might say, of Lowry's own two sides, of the writer, but also the committed artist in those two characters. I suppose another thing to say is that there's kind of a historical psychogeography of the setting itself, with the volcanoes, but also with a big gulf. There's a kind of a rift right in the middle of the village. And I think Hugh thinks to himself, the village was like the Times in that respect. Wherever you turned, the abyss was waiting for you around the corner. So the geography and the history are united in that way. And upsettingly, as we see at the end, the body of the consul is thrown into the abyss. So, like the world itself, he kind of ends in that way.
Yeah, and there's that kind of drumbeat about the Spanish Civil War, the repeated phrase, I think, is it they're losing the Battle of the Ebro, something like that, isn't it? It keeps popping up, not popping, sort of booming through almost. Interesting what you said about the fact that it took Lowry so long to write it. Do we have any information on like different versions and the revisions he made?
Yes, fascinatingly, I think he wrote three main versions, and a lot of that material is actually collected in his archive, which is at the University of British Columbia. So you can actually see in those different versions the kinds of changes that he made, some of which were to characters. Originally, Yvonne was not the ex-wife, she was the consul's daughter. I think it's a lot more powerful as the ex-wife. And Hugh was her boyfriend rather than the consul's half-brother. And there are traces of that kind of Oedipal, if to want of a better phrase, relationship that remain, because it seems that Yvonne has had, if not an affair, a closeness with Hugh, which the consul is jealous of. So the boyfriend of the earlier drafts has become the half-brother in the later ones. But the main thing is it's transformed out of all recognition, much more in terms of how it's narrated, that everything we've been talking about, like the free-floating voices, the little bits and pieces, the fragments of everyday life, were all added gradually. So I was thinking, if there's anyone out there who is an aspiring novelist, it really pays to revise what you have. Larry was absolutely convinced this was going to be a really great project. He was right, but it turned into one by all the drafting and redrafting, the rewriting, the taking a step back from the conventional narrator and letting the action be seen through each of the characters in turn, in a sense, rather than having a third person narrative voice. I'm not sure if those drafts have at all been digitized, but they are available to look at, and you can really see almost step by step what Larry was doing. And not only Larry, but his second wife, Marjorie Bonner, seems to have really said to him, you've really got to edit this. And she was really instrumental, I think, in making it the text that it is today.
Interesting, really interesting. And those revisions took decades. It's fascinating that it, really was a sort of lifetime's project. Just get my next question up. Yeah, I guess this comes back to the question of action. So we could bring Hugh into this as well, because I think he has an interesting backstory. And in fact, Yvonne, who, has acted and she's come back, and it's so tragic that she has come back and yet Jeffrey can't get his act together. But I mean, he has moments of kind of clarity and resolution in the middle of all the chaos, but generally doesn't or can't act on these. So he can't really shape the world according to his desires, his intentions. And this links back a little bit, I think, to some things you've already said, but do you think the novel then is commenting on human nature in general, on our relationship as individuals with the wider world? So is it, could we take it as a sort of existential novel, which again is a slightly different reading maybe to the political and historical symbolism we just talked about?
Well, I think that these readings aren't necessarily exclusive, because
Sure.
obviously
Yeah.
for all of us, all of these different aspects of life are in our minds all the time. And I think the novel, in a way, is a really great representation of those different kinds of language and approaches to life, literature, philosophy, politics, history. But that is a good question about Jeffrey can sometimes, as you said, he has moments where he can see that his and as the reader, we really want him and Yvonne to be together. It seems that they absolutely love each other, and they even have a kind of a shared vision of what a different kind of life together could be. And very touchingly, the form that takes in the novel is a version of what Larry actually did achieve with his second wife, which was to go and live in Canada and have a little shack,
Mm,
write, be free, be your own person, live simply,
mm,
grow your own vegetables. And that I hadn't remembered that there was quite so much detail about that in the north, away from the heat, which is obviously great, but the pitiless sunshine that there is in Mexico.
mm,
Um, so in a way, that's not to give a biographical reading of the fact that even though this is to some extent a self-portrait, obviously that's not how Larry himself ended up. He did manage to achieve a loving relationship with a person who entered into his um, writing life, and they lived together and had a fabulous time in Canada while they were able to do that. But that there is a sense in the way that you suggest that you, to go back to that idea that you are your own worst enemy. In the edition that I have here, there's an introduction by Stephen Spender, and I thought that he put it quite well about the consul Geoffrey Firmin, that he's isolated, which he hates, but in a way that he can only live by being isolated. So there's something about him wanting to be alone. To be alone, he has to reject love, and then he can't be with Yvonne, and in the end, he's punished because he rejected love. So there's a kind of a terrible, almost. I feel the word Christian popping into my mind. He's almost like somebody who can't enter into the fullness of human life for various reasons. Um, and that allegorical journey is acted out in the novel. There's no way that we can change that, because once we've read the first chapter, we know that that's coming. And even for Geoffrey, as it happens, it's sort of inevitable in a
mm.
horrible way.
Yeah. And I realize actually, beginning of your answer, I realize I'm posing questions as sort of A or B. And of course, great literature will often allow itself to be read on so many levels. And I think it's one of the fantastic things about Under the Volcano is that, it brings so much, and you can sort of approach it from all these different angles. And speaking of great literature, I mean, an interesting fact is that it does come up on these sort of best novels of the 20th century type lists. Yet, I don't think it's that well known. Um, would you agree with that? And if so, why do you think that's the case?
That's definitely really a big question. If anybody happens to do a little search online, just put in Under the Volcano, you'll find that, as you've just said, Ivan, that people are constantly revisiting it. In the Guardian alone, the newspaper in Britain, it's mentioned, I would say, every 5 years as a classic. Anthony Burgess's list of 99 novels, Under Volcano is high in that list. There was a kind of online reading group. They entered into Under the Volcano. People were really positive about it. But I recently had cause to say to somebody, they asked me what I wrote my PhD on, and I said Malcolm Lowry, and of course they thought it was L.S. Lowry, which is often a mistake people make.
Mm.
So I said, I'm not an art historian. I didn't write about the painter from Manchester of the stick figures. I wish I could have done that.
It'd
But
be a
people had
very
not heard it.
confusing conversation that would actually belong in Under the Volcano, complete cross purposes. But yeah.
They're not very similar figures, or perhaps they are. Um, One of the reasons I think is that Under Volcano can't really be easily pigeonholed in many respects. As our conversation has shown, it's kind of a modernist novel, but it's not really quite like Ulysses, nor like Faulkner. It's more, as Stephen Spender says in the introduction, which really struck me, he says it's romantic in many respects. It's about a romance, but it also has a romantic aspect to it. Um, but I think another thing is that what kind of literature is it? In our contemporary literature course, I think everything was supposed to be either published, or maybe this is when I was a student, actually, everything was supposed to be British. So there was a problem if you wanted to write about, as I did for my dissertation, not my PhD, which was on Catherine Mansfield, who was officially from New Zealand. I think those kind of strictures don't really exist now. But
I
Lowry
hope
lived
not.
in
Yeah.
Canada. You would hope not.
Yeah.
It's bizarre. And of course, now you can write about literature and translation, which,
Mm.
or even in its original language, as you should be able to. But Lowry kind of falls between many different stools, or to put it differently, brings together many different national kinds of writing in a kind of transnational way that he did live in Canada for a long time. That's why his archive is in the University of British Columbia. And as critics like, for example, Cheryl Grace have said, even Under the Volcano has got a lot in common with Canadian writing, which is often about the wilderness versus the city. There's a lot in Under the Volcano about the history of Mexico and its colonization, which also chimes not only with Canadian, but also with British literature when it engages with the colonial and imperial past. But I think people often, because we're still trapped in these ways of thinking about who's a canonical writer, people often, they don't think of Lowry as a British identified writer, but nor is he thought of as a Canadian writer, nor is he thought of, which I feel he should be, as a kind of global,
Mm.
international writer. Um, so I feel, in a way, that's the strength of Under the Volcano and his biography and backstory as an author. But I wonder if that is why people haven't routinely come across it in other kinds of ways that you might come across
Mm.
literature of that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that makes sense to me. Where do you put it exactly, and geographically, but also as modernism, it's quite a bit later than something like Ulysses, when that had its moment quite a bit earlier. That sort of stream of consciousness stuff. So yeah, interesting to know. I wonder if it will, if it's repeatedly referenced in papers and these lists, whether it will sort of gradually accrue a kind of canonicity. It'd be interesting to know, you know, if it does kind of solidify at the top there at some point. But well, let's hope so anyway.
That's right. And I think sometimes people get attracted to those kind of things, like lists of the best novels that aren't well known. Um, and I think people like to maybe start to read through them. And I think until recently, maybe Alistair Gray's Lanark would have been one of those, which is
Mm,
also another fabulous novel, which is hard to, because of the film Poor Things. Maybe that is a bit better known. Obviously, there was a film of Under the Volcano, but that it's, even though it's quite a cinematic novel, it's very hard to film.
mm,
Maybe if people decide to read it, you'll see it's extremely visual and it seems to use some cinematic techniques, but it's, what kind of film would it be? Would it be an expressionist, not a realist film?
mm,
Um, so yes, I think you're right to suggest, Ivan, that over time it's accrued a bit more of a readership, but I do feel it has a bit of a slightly cult following rather than a mass following. It
yeah,
might be.
yeah. I feel like people don't know it. Like you said, you say Lowry, people think painter. They don't. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Let's get a bit more theoretical, because you've you've read Under the Volcano through the theories of Mikhail Bakhtin, a Russian literary theorist who's a wonderful writer in his own right from a theoretical perspective, has some fascinating ideas. This is a big question because Bakhtin has his whole body of work and many, key concepts. But could you explain a little bit about who Bakhtin was, some of his key theories, and why you've approached Under the Volcano from that theoretical perspective, all in a few minutes,
Yes, that.
if you could?
Well, to try and put Bakhtin in a nutshell, as you've just said, Ivan, he's become, I would say, better known than Lowry, actually, a
Mm,
well-known Russian theorist and literary critic, of a similar era to Lowry, really, who wrote particularly about Dostoevsky. And maybe you could say that Lowry's writing actually has a little bit in common with Dostoevsky, that it's about kind of big moral and ethical questions, but and written about heroes and characters who you might feel at a distance from, at the same time as really feeling immersed in their destiny. But I think there are two specific parts of Bakhtin's many theories that really give us a window into what Lowry has achieved in Under the Volcano. And one of them is the idea of clashing discourses or clashing different kinds of language. Bakhtin's really keen on that. I think he would suggest that the language you use every day does that. He calls it dialogism, and you can tell from that word it means a dialogue or interaction between different languages. And it goes back in a way to one of the questions you asked at the beginning about what are we to make of the use of Spanish in the novel. And I feel, and in fact, I wrote about this, I believe, in my final exam at university, that Bakhtin's theories can have light cast on them by the use that Lowry makes of the different languages, that the Spanish interacts with the English, but in a way it doesn't matter if you can't really understand it, because you can see that there are two languages battling for meaning together. Even if you can only understand a fragment of what the Spanish is getting at, you'll see what its significance is for the characters. So just as Bakhtin would predict, meaning emerges out of the coming together of those two different national languages. And those aren't the only discourses or languages that are present in Under the Volcano. It's full of references to other literary texts, some of which you recognize if you read it, some of which you wouldn't necessarily, but you can tell when somebody's quoting. So I find Under the Volcano, in a very overt way, exhibits what Bakhtin would call the interaction of different languages and different levels of language, some of which are very everyday and not really valorized, like menus and school books and all that kind of thing. And some are high art, like Shakespeare and Marlowe. So those different levels of languages are present. I think I said there were two facets of what Bakhtin writes about. Actually, I think there are three. The next one is what he calls polyphony, which is not having that kind of overbearing third person narrator to tell you all about what's going on and all about the characters. And Under Volcano, I feel, really does that brilliantly. And it was the result of Lowry's editing process, so that all the information we gather about all of the characters comes from each other. It's not told to us from an external perspective. It's all the consul thinking back to his early days of marriage with Yvonne very poignantly, or Yvonne's letters arriving out of time to him, talking about their love for each other, rather than a narrator just telling us in chronological order how they met, how they got married. So you have to piece it all together yourself as the characters think or tell you about it. So I suppose what I would say about Lowry's drafting and redrafting over time is that he made his novel more polyphonic as he went on. And again, you can tell from that word itself, polyphony, suggesting many voiced. There are many voices giving their perspective in the novel, rather than one single straightforward narrator. And I know the example people often give about that kind of stereotypical third person narrator is George Eliot, because there does seem to be a very strong sense of a guiding external perspective in George Eliot's novels, though they too are no doubt Bakhtinian in their way. And the third and last thing that I'd like to mention, though I think there are other aspects of Bakhtin which can be illuminating, is his idea of what he calls the carnivalesque. And again, to put something quite complex into a nutshell, this suggests that the kind of real life carnivals of the Middle Ages take their most telling form in the contemporary era in literary texts. And as we've mentioned, there is an actual carnival in Under the Volcano, and it's there for the Day of the Dead. So it's a bit of a macabre kind of carnival, but that would really suit what Bakhtin's talking about, because I suppose what he would say is that it allows everybody to change their roles for one day. And as we've mentioned, Under the Volcano is all about things changing for one day. The dead come back to visit the living. Those who have a high status are brought down low. That happens in a very material way in the form of the Ferris wheel, where you go up and then you come down. So I think, again, a carnivalesque approach in Bakhtin's suggestion is really illuminating for Under the Volcano. And it can be helpful for seeing some of its little images or symbols or details, like people on the Day of the Dead eat chocolate skulls. I feel that image in itself encapsulates the idea of the carnivalesque, that it's a chocolate skull. It's like both death and life in the same thing. It's sweet, but it's about death, and being asked to buy one and eat it. So, yes, I would, if anybody feels impelled to read about Bakhtin, I feel you would immediately see a lot of literary texts, particularly Under Volcano, illuminated in that way.
And just on the carnivalesque, I mean, in Bakhtin, it's this sort of liberating time and space where all these different strata of society come together. The voices mix. So there's this relationship with polyphony, for example. And there's a sort of, almost, to put modern language on it, a sort of democratic impulse that, yes, the low becomes high, the high becomes low. And it's where the ordinary people get to sort of speak back, in a sense. So it's generally coded very positively in Bakhtin's writing. You can maybe see the negative potential of that, though, when things are sort of let loose. And do you think in Under the Volcano, is it a sort of darker mode of carnivalesque, if you like, where, as you said, the lowering of his body, Jeffrey's body, is physical death, right? It's not a metaphor. He's dead. Do you think Lowry's sort of recasting that in a darker sense? We're seeing the more negative side of the carnivalesque that Bakhtin maybe doesn't address as much.
I think that phrase, the dark carnival, is exactly right. That would be a phrase that I would think of in relation to Under the Volcano and possibly other novels as well. I know that Bakhtin's been criticised for giving slightly, maybe too positive a gloss on carnivals, which in their as a historical phenomenon could involve violence against women, against minorities, cruelty to animals, all kinds of things that we might not want to think about. And as you were suggesting, it's only for a day. And I think the time-limited nature of such a liberatory celebration is clear in the fact that these events in Under the Volcano are only for a day. Yvonne comes back only for a day. She's raised, but I think also that maybe the pressure of the historical events, to go back to that angle of Lowry's novel, means that a straightforward liberatory carnival, even though there has been some democratization of a mixture of different languages, people of all kinds of social standing have been allowed to speak and been acknowledged. Mexican Indians, but also the fascists are present and speak, and their words are recorded, as well as the consul, his wife, and his half-brother. So I wonder if, in a way, the kind of what we might call the pessimism of the novel, despite its really energetic and optimistic language, is partly because of the times, that you can't really imagine a straightforward rebirth, except in the fiction way of going back to the beginning of the novel again and starting to read again.
That's a really interesting way of finishing, to come back to this sort of circular structure, which again is this sort of the carnivalesque inversion and circularity of life, but yeah, in a kind of pessimistic cast, because we're going to read about Jeffrey drinking himself to oblivion once more. So yeah. Well, let's finish there. Thank you, Sue, so much for a really fascinating conversation. Do hope people are inspired to read the novel as a result. I do thoroughly recommend it, and Bakhtin for anybody who wants to get into theory. So thanks once again, Sue. Been a real pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Ivan. It's been my pleasure.